Good morning. My name is Tamana Dalcio. I'm a proud member of the CRCAIH team, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Cynthia Pearson. She's from the School of Social Work and the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, which is a National Center of Excellence at the University of Washington. Dr. Cynthia Pearson is a research associate professor at the School of Social Work and the interim director of research at the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, National Center of Excellence, there at the University of Washington. Dr. Pearson has collaborated with American Indian communities in the development of tribally approved research policies and publication guidelines. She meets community members where they are and identifies community ways of knowing and resources to create innovative, sustainable interventions. She has over 15 years of experience collaborating with indigenous communities from Africa, China, and with 10 years experience working with Pacific Northwest tribal communities. With over 40 peer-reviewed publications, Dr. Pearson's expertise is in designing community-based health interventions from an ecological perspective that emphasizes social, political, environmental, and historical determinants of health. Dr. Pearson.
Well, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am, just a little bit about who I am. I'm Hungarian Jew and German, and my grandfather came to these lands right before World War II, thankfully. And it's such a pleasure to be here today. I'd first like to acknowledge the lands that we're on today, the Spirit Lake Nation, and really thank you for hosting us in this summit. And my talk today is going to really focus on, it was funded to adapt the CITI training. How many of you are aware with the CITI, the Human Subjects Research Training? So you've taken it. And so when we are engaged with our communities, and we often ask our community members to also take the CITI training if they're going to be conducting research. Well, what we found was sometimes it would take them up to 15 hours to take it, and then a week or two later we'll kind of check in with them. What did they get from it? What can they carry away with it? And it was very, very little. Well, it's important to have our community partners engage in the research process to help guide what we do. And so really coming out of community, they said, this doesn't work for us. We need something that would work for us. And so we are in the process of adapting CITI. We've pulled together expert panels of over 40 people, American Indian and Alaska Native people, from scholars to community members to IRB administrators, and they've really kind of set the guidance of how to develop this training curriculum. So today I'm going to go and share this work that we've been doing, and I'm going to first start off with a little bit to talk about some of the research that have served to pathologize American Indian and Alaska Native people and other people of color, but my focus is on indigenous folks. And the reason why we're starting off with that is because there's a lot of people don't want to be engaged in research. There's a lot of negativity around it, but there's also a lot of benefit that can come from it. So it's important to understand the history. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the ethical principles that guide the concerns for how research shapes or reinforces stereotypes, as well as the Belmont principles, and how do we apply those at a community level. And then we're going to explore how researchers, community review boards, and IRBs can be mindful of how to conduct research in a good way. So first, when we think about the Belmont Report, the Belmont Report is a summary, provides a summary of the principles and the guidelines for how we conduct research. The Belmont Report was actually written from an individual perspective. When we talk about beneficence, it means to do no harm. When we look at respect, it's respect for person. That means each person are informed of the research and have the autonomy or the decision to decide whether or not to participate in that research. And then we have justice. Justice means that research should be available to benefit the people who are actually providing the risk. So as opposed to conducting research in poor communities for a high-priced medical drug, that's not going to be accessible for them, that's not justice. Those who put the risk into research should also benefit. So today's presentation is going to really look on how this expert panel and the information that we've received from community is going to change the city. We're currently with that project. We have created the curriculum. We are now evaluating that curriculum in a national study, and we expect that it will be live and ready to be accessible in about 18 months. We are working closely with CITI. If it's as good or better than the CITI, it would serve as a full certification curriculum that meets NIH and federal regulations, and then it will also be a full program for CITI. It would be part of their base package, so there would be no more additional cost. We are also working with CRCAIH and AIAN to help kind of get that implemented, and they become members of CITI so they can make that available to tribal communities that may not already have a subscription with them. So with that, when we look at the Belmont report, again, it's situated for the individual, but we know that individuals operate within communities. And there are very many different types of communities. There are communities of interest or experience. That means people who are kind of addressing or looking at cancer or diabetes. There's also a community of place, like these lands we're on today, in tribal communities and reservation lands. And then there's communities of commonality, such as CRCAIH, or people to come together, urban American Indian Health Services, so people that come together as groups. So first, let's take a look at some of the barriers to engagement. We talk about research that pathologizes groups as well as forces stereotypes. So it's important to understand the history. So we'll step back a little bit in time. And we know that these lands all belong to American Indian Alaska Native people. But under the guise of kind of a quasi-Darwinistic reasoning, science, they used a rationalization that Anglo-Saxon heritage made Americans supremely fit and gave them the rationalization to take over these lands. This also continued during the boarding school era, when children were taken and boarding schools were set up, and there were actually scientific, again, research being conducted on Native people, the removal of organs and radiation exposure, as well as exposure to TB, to test how this medications or stuff could change over time. Furthermore, it continues to pathologize American Indian Alaska Native people as dysfunctional and did not directly inform them of what research was going on or what medical experiences were occurring. We see this in 1928, the Alberta passed legislation allowing schools to officially conduct sterilization on women and girls. In 1933, British Columbia followed, and then actually, and these dates are also alarming, from 1973 to 76, Indian Health Service was also engaged in this activity. So we can kind of understand why groups may not be biting at the bits to conduct research. And as President Lindquist said, we still have the whole stories of the helicopter pilot coming in, or helicopter researcher rather, coming in and conducting research, taking data, going off, and not giving back to community. We're also aware that the Hafasupai in Arizona State University, this recently happened. The settlement just happened. So I think it's important when we look at conducting ethical research with communities that we keep in mind that there's a lot of good research, but there's a lot of harm that can come from research too if we're not vigilant and paying attention to the way that research is conducted. And then another issue is obtaining wrong or insufficient community approval. Community approval gets a little touchy, and we'll explore that in just a few minutes, the diversity behind where meeting communities where they're at and getting the right kind and a thorough review of the research process. We also know through science there's been a lot of appropriation of cultural knowledge. How many people are familiar with Maslow's theory? Okay, well, really it belongs to the Blackfeet. So Maslow hung out with the Blackfeet and pretty much just tipped so that the triangle is actually a teepee. It's not a triangle. And the Blackfeet actually start self-actualization at the bottom, and whereas Maslow just put it on the top. So he basically just flipped it and then took it as his own. Aspirin, another thing that really came from American Indian and Alaska Native people. Little pill, the miracle drug that fixes everything, is really from the peoples of these lands. So how do we, another issue is also funders. For a long time, and we're starting to see some changes more recently, but for a long time, funders were always, they're going to take taxpayers' dollars, they're going to fund from a deficit model. They're going to fund what's broke and what needs to be fixed. They're not likely to fund what works. But I think now we're beginning to understand we can spend a lot of money on things that don't work. We need to find out what does work and start spending some money on there. But if you're going to go before your tribal community or your tribal council and all you're doing is saying what's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong, that can get pretty discouraging. And I think folks are really tired of hearing about it. This is a culture, these are people that have survived centuries of affronts, and they're very resilient and very strong. So let's tap into those. Let's identify what those qualities and characteristics are and build from the strength-based model. So again, ethics, the study that's currently involved, and we have this group and again 40 people that have really come together to kind of guide the research. So in this next phase, I'm going to share with you some of the lessons learned, some of the stories, and some of the direction that they've proposed that we take. So when we look at beneficence, so what we were told, it's not enough to do no harm. Research in Indian country has to do good. It must benefit American Indian and Alaska Native people. Doing research that might help the general population, that's great. But first and foremost, it has to benefit American Indian and Alaska Native people, if not the community itself. And good research requires a purposeful approach to improve the well-being of Native people across these lands. And to ensure research is a good fit for the community, the research itself has to ask, will it benefit Native people? Because if it's not, do it somewhere else in the community that it will benefit. There's a wonderful piece of work that I'd like to plug, which is Walking Softly and Listening Carefully. It really talks about engaging communities, what our expert panel members really wanted us to do was talk about community-based participatory research. How do you engage communities? How do you sit at the table and have these good discussions? Walking Softly and Listening Carefully by CITI really kind of helps map that out. If you haven't looked at it or aren't aware of it, I strongly encourage you to review it. Respect for persons, that expands from the individual to the community. Respecting American Indian and Alaska Native tribal sovereignty and community autonomy is crucial to building trust. And gaining trust takes active listening and sitting at the table. I think many of us in this room, from what I'm hearing from the introductions, is it's important to spend that time well up front and having those conversations. Just dropping in and doing research isn't going to work. I was actually a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal, West Africa, and the first thing that Peace Corps tells you to do, it's a 2-year term. The first year, they said, do nothing. You sit and drink tea. That's what you're supposed to do. And the reason why they tell you that is so you can learn. You can understand what's important to the people that you're working with, to hear their stories, to understand the political situation, to understand their strengths, as well as where more additional support may be needed. And so too with CVPR. Oops. The next one is justice. Well, when we look at the Belmont report, justice is really this distributed justice. Those who experience the risk should also experience the benefits. But in our training curriculum, what we're looking at is procedural justice. That procedures are fair and not exploitive. But when you're looking at fair and not exploitive, by whose definition over which you're doing that? As an outside researcher, you're not going to know because you come with it from your own perspective. So it's important to really gain that insight from community and what's fair and not exploitive for that culture, for those people. In other words, seek to understand the science and the ways to conduct science through the eyes of the people that it's being impacted by. And then how should science itself change? If we come from it from a Western epistemology, then it's going to have those inherent dominant views. We've got to look at science from a different perspective, and that's the indigenous perspective. And it's, again, those wisdoms come up from the community and are embedded within the community. So really kind of acknowledging that, and in the development and the designs of research projects, to pull in those indigenous knowledges. And then this is an interesting thing that really, when you look at IRBs and review of research protocol, there's two questions that they ask. First, is it research, and is it human subjects? Well, when we look at human subjects, the way the common rule states is it's any living human being. Well, what we heard from very many of the communities is that's not necessarily so from their perspective. At minimum, so tribes may require that genetic and other body specimens are actually returned to the community, that those stories, those data belong to the tribe, belong to the people, and belong to their histories. So here again, we're kind of looking at changing the definition or expanding the definition of what human subjects is, and that's based on the community perspective and what they need. So this next section is talking about enhancing American Indian and Alaska Native community involvement and how to minimize harm and maximize benefits. So we'll start with the harms first. Invasion of privacy. So if an individual tribal identifiers, so we talk about individual identifiers, so that's my name, it's my social security number, it's my driver's license, but now we're talking about at a community level. What does it mean at a community level? Tribal affiliation. But if I don't write in a research report, and I'm not saying the Spirit Lake Nation in the report, but if I say and describe Spirit Lake as everything else, the geographic area, the population size, and I don't give the name, that's still an identifier. It's a tribal identifier. It's a community identifier. So we have to think about that as well. And then also the use of publicly available information. Now this was an interesting story. What had happened was a researcher had worked with the community and they conducted a project to reduce substance use among youth within their community. And they designed an intervention, they employed it, and they had baseline data, and then they had post data. Well, what they did is they shared, or they compared the intervention site to another tribal community next to them. Now, they didn't talk to the tribal community near them. What they did is they pulled down publicly available data. So it's out there on the web. And then when they wrote the reports, they named both tribes. The one tribe they were working with gave permission, they were fine with that. But the tribe that they used publicly available data did not give the permission. Well, what happened was that created kind of conflict between the two neighboring tribes. It's like, we were never part of this treaty. We never agreed to it. And the response was, well, the data was publicly available. It doesn't matter. You're still producing potentially stigmatized data. You've engaged this group by even naming them in a research project when they weren't even asked. So the lesson here is, whenever a tribe is named in a research report, whether it's publicly available data or not, the researcher requests prior permission. Remember, looking at beneficence do no harm. So we have to be careful of research. Belmont report, anybody else will tell you, publicly available data, you don't need to get permission. But what we heard from our expert panel members is that you should. And the way to do this is consult with your stakeholders to review the study materials prior to release of any tribal identifiers. The next is wrong or insufficient tribal permission, and I'll talk about this several times. But tribal approval process against tribes, rural and urban settings of any type of study. So it really runs the gamut. Some places have review boards, some places have just elder community committees. Some have maybe an IRB, but they don't have a federal-wide assurance, so they're not recognized to have that review federally, so they'll have to partner. Sometimes there can be 2 or 3, 4 review processes over a protocol. But it's also important that the researcher should ensure that the approval from the appropriate regulatory committees. For example, if I go to my IRB, I'm at the University of Washington, and I say that, oh, my protocol's been reviewed in this committee and it was reviewed by a small group, my IRB is not going to know if it's received proper review. So it really kind of comes back to me as that researcher. And what we really want to get across here is if you're not receiving full and encompassing review of your protocol, I guarantee you it will fall back down, it will fall apart down the road. So it's really kind of expanding. You don't want to overdo it. You want to make sure your research protocols get out in the field. You don't want to spend 2 years waiting for approval. There are some techniques that we've used within our institute. Once we get the funding dollars, we might talk to our project officer and say, you know what, we want to sit back for 6 months. We're not going to pull any money off of this protocol, off of this grant, and we want to revisit, because you write a grant, you get the approval, you might even have a tribal resolution, and it takes 1.5 years before you actually get funded. So your committee members have changed. So once you get that funding, you can go back to them and reintroduce it to the people who, 1.5 years. I mean, I can barely remember what happened a week ago, much less 1.5 years. But have them review the protocol, get their permission. Just like an informed consent, the informed consent is a process that happens over time. You check in with your participants. Just because your participant says yes, they've agreed to participate in this research, they can drop out at any time along the way. Well, this is also true with communities. Just because they've agreed and they've got tribal resolution and you're good to go, doesn't mean they have to keep staying in that project. So it's really important to continue to that consenting process and continue given that feedback and hearing from communities as you move on. And most importantly is to respect and acknowledge that unique sovereign status. So the feds say, okay, we need IRB review, and the IRBs have to be federally, have an FWA, federal-wide insurance. That's what they need to meet their criteria. Tribes could have any one of those review boards. They could have their own IRB that may not have an FWA. But it's their review process is equally as valid as what the feds are asking for. Breach of confidentiality. Disclosure of tribal level data regarding physical or emotional distress could harm a tribe's reputation and then misuse or taking or claiming of American Indian Alaskan Native culture or spiritual properties unethical and in many cases illegal. So this story came apart, or this lesson came when one of our expert panels was sharing a story where a researcher, won't give the discipline because I think sometimes we harp too much on anthropologist or archaeologist, but was up in a cave and doing some research and had found some old bones, and so they dug them up and they took them out. Well, somebody from the community had observed this and was highly distressed because it was actually a traditional burial ground of which was her late grandfather. And so the harm that was created was huge. They didn't actually find something old. So here again, working closely with community, you don't take anything out of the community, and that's old bones, that's data or anything without that review from the community, because they're going to know best what really belongs there and what can be released. So unauthorized release of data could have a negative impact on the participant, the tribal community, and it can create psychological, social, or economic harms. Study procedures and methods. So here it's the chance and extent that harm could occur. One, sound research design. Here again, working with the community, finding out from their interpretations, their beliefs, their values, what that means. And also to understand that that research and research protocol and sound research design is very situational place. It's very situational. It's place and culture and time based. So what might have been appropriate 10 years ago in this community may not at all be appropriate. And this also goes to do with thinking about secondary data analysis. What might have been approved and okay then may not be 10 or 15 years once that data comes through and gets clean. And here again, I want to go back to going on to that informed consent is an ongoing process and should be revisited. And it might be okay that you've got your consent form and you've got the tribal resolution and they say that you can use this, but a check-in is extremely important. And here again, research in IRBs alone may not be able to fully assess risk within a community or a study protocol, and these do change over time. Assessing risk objectively. Oh, I think I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit on the last talk, but confirm with each new research project, even for secondary data analysis. And it's important to have meaningful community involvement in the research planning process to help assess risk at every phase. So I guess I did this slide before, but here we go. Interpretation of data and reporting of results. And I love CRCAIH's data management document that you have out. I haven't had the opportunity to review it, but I think that's extremely valuable. At our institute as well, we have on our website research protocols, publication protocols, data sharing agreements. All those are kind of based, they're there. They could be adapted by communities, but it provides something for you to get developed. It's important to have those conversations before a project is even identified, when a project is identified, after funding comes in. All these things, again, change over time. How will the data would be handled? One of the tools that we use, oops, I went too far there, is we have worked with our office to sponsor programs that the data is owned by the tribe. So this is approved through NIH. It fits with our office's sponsors programs. because I know there's some arguments, well, how can, if the data is owned by the tribe, how is it released? We have an obligation for publication. What does that look like? How do we deal with that? And it's like data is owned by the tribe, but it's leased back to the Research Institute for the purpose of the aims of the grant. So write good aims, what you're going to use the data for, because it's usually in your documents. And I think that also prevents some of the harms, like the Hafasupai study, where data was collected for diabetes, but then later on got used for something else and reported for something else that the tribe really never agreed to. And this helps protect those data from being improperly used. If a researcher wants to come back and use the data for something else, then it does require them to come back and to obtain that permission to use that data. And this to summarize ways to mitigate harm. Keep in mind that it's time, space, place based. Keep going back for approval and communication, and that communities are given the choice to participate in research, and that informed consent process is ongoing. And in tribal settings, make sure you have tribal approval is obtained. And in urban settings, this looked really different. So although technically one could, in Seattle, Washington, do a recruitment with American Indian and Alaska Native urbans in the urban setting, and they don't necessarily need, a researcher doesn't necessarily need to work with a Native organization. But what we encourage is that you do so, because a lot of those organizations are also serving that population. So just as you respect tribes, now an urban organization is not going to have sovereignty, but the same respect is due. Bring them in, keeping them informed, getting permission. They're serving that population in a lot of ways. Now benefits, some good stuff, right? So research resources, really to facilitate community involvement in the research process, opportunities for community members to conduct research. And I would say, like, you know, in the past, and I do see things changing now, in the past it was you get your community members to collect data. Well, if Walking Softly, you really bring your community members in the very beginning to help design the project and to deliver the intervention. We currently have a project out in the field now. If we developed or delivered that intervention in a really kind of pristine clinical setting where we brought in master's degrees, people from the university to deliver the intervention, that's not reality. That's setting up the community for failure, because if we show that research project is efficacious, and then it says, well, yes, it works great, and then we employ it into the community when they have, or when they're dealing with the limited resources that they have, and the project fails, it's not the community that fails, it's the research that failed, because the research did not take into consideration those infrastructure barriers that are also in place. When research is actually delivered in the community by community, then the research can actually identify other barriers that are actually being in place, and then look at designing interventions that do take in the ecological perspective from the political system, from the resource, the infrastructure, as well as to a counselor, the person, the skill set of the person delivering it, to the person itself that is supposed to be supporting. And then distributive research, which is again what CRCAIH does, is they provide subcontracts to communities so you can get that important indirects, because that is what helps build the infrastructure of communities, not only in research but in programs. And then provide support for community grant acquisition. A lot of what we do, and I've seen many researchers in Indian country do this, like my portfolio is research. That's where I really come in and I do, but communities also need program grants. They need to employ programs. There's a lot of suicide prevention grants out there, such as Native Connections, or the Garrett Lee Smith. But those grants require a program evaluator. They require some of that support. So researchers not only serve as researchers, but they also serve in other ways that support the community to build. So it really is a collaborative research process. And then research review, I discussed this again. So there's IRB reviews. I think it's important to state that for the federal government or federal grants, you need an IRB review, and those IRBs have to have federal-wide insurance. For tribal communities, some of their IRBs have FWAs, some don't, but those review processes are just as equal and just as valued and should be honored. You'll just need two. If your tribal IRB is federally wide, have an FWA, then they can actually delegate review authority to somebody else, IHS review board or the academic review board, or the same thing, an academic institute could delegate review to the tribal IRB. A very important clarification that any research that is being conducted on tribal land must have tribal approval. And it could be any one of those ways of being approved. I think this was a real important thing that the expert panel just continued to stress upon. And then what are some tools for a strong partnership? Community-based participatory research. I think I'm almost speaking to the choir here. Probably every one of us do this. Meeting communities where they're at. Even if a community doesn't have a IRB, they do have some kind of elder group or community review if they're interested in doing research. So CBPR kind of runs this gamut. It's really, really engaged, and then it's just more just having them review a protocol or something that comes back. But just because a community doesn't have the research infrastructure to do full CBPR, where they're involved in every part of the research project and they're doing their own data analysis, or they have people to run the data, it's really kind of that balance. How can you move communities forward? And again, CRCAIH is just great. That's why they said they have only engaged with 6 communities thus far, is because they're really providing that infrastructure and that growth to bring communities up. And then the other thing to look for strong partnerships is research protocols, data use agreements, and are those agreements legally binding? So we recently experienced this where the tribal nation and the academic institute would put together a data sharing agreement, but it wasn't really reviewed by the attorneys. And was it a legal document? Because if you have a data sharing agreement and you say that the data can only be used for X, Y, and Z, and then the data is used for something else, so what? Where's the regulation behind that? What happens? Researcher may never work in Indian country again. But forget that. They've created harm, potential harm to a community. So this is where those binding legal agreements come in. At least it kind of sets some kind of checks and balances to the system. And then implications for data sharing. There's data integrity, transferring the data back to the community and transfer it back to a way that can be used. So it's great that there's academic reports that get done, peer-reviewed publications, but also a community report where there's frequencies and tables, so community can actually cut and paste that information out into one of their own grant application, so they could readily use that for some of those program grants that are available. Also, some communities are ready to take on data and to ensure that the data is secured and it's not going to be accessible. When you're working in small communities, if a researcher gives back identifiable data and there's a breach in that data, that can also create a lot of harm. So as a researcher, think about the data that's going back. You're not going to be sending back people's names and identifying information. It's likely going to be de-identified. And then the protections that be in place. And then also for strong partnerships, again, have the letters of support, memorandums of understanding, or even tribal resolutions, depending on how the community operates. Those documents should not be seen as barriers, but really facilitators of doing good research. Because if you're having those conversations early on, when you finally get the money and you start conducting research, you've got a lot of the hard stuff out of the way. And then you can go back and revisit it. There's nothing worse than getting this money and you have a deadline that you have to meet and you're saying you need to do this, you need to do this. But remember, with the Belmont Report, it's about respect. Respect for persons and respect for community. And it's about them having the choice and the autonomy to make the decision to stay in research. And then finally, what reviewers can look for, and this is any reviewer. Researcher is a reviewer, IRBs, community people. So researchers and research groups are new to a community. So if a group or a researcher is coming into a community and they've only been with that community for a year, they're really not going to have an in-depth understanding of what the structure is or what that important review process is supposed to look like. So if you're reviewing protocol and somebody's new, I think I would ask a little more, a few more questions about, are you sure you got the review? Is it this group? Do you need another one? Can you convince me that you do indeed have the right review for your protocol? And also, the review could be a little tricky. I work in communities where if we're just doing a needs assessment or kind of an epidemiological study, maybe just the group that we're working with, the review process and the letters of support is sufficient. But if we're going to do a randomized controlled trial or an intervention that we're changing behavior, then maybe it does need a tribal resolution. And again, this differs by community and community. But nonetheless, ask those questions. Look at the degree of harm or risk that may be from potential from the research, and then kind of evaluate whether or not there's good review over that protocol and good approval over it. And then also look to see if there's any research or publication protocols, data sharing agreements, because those are going to tell you if the research team has been actually engaging the community in that process and having those conversations. And then finally, ask, does this research have the potential to benefit the community?